Stephen Barota, commander of a partisan unit, led decisive attacks against the Nazis, sabotaging transport and providing vital support to the resistance. Captured by the occupiers, he was taken to the public square and executed on March 27, 1942, in Valjevo, Yugoslavia. The image of his final moments reflects the brutal Nazi repression against the efforts for freedom. Wilhelm Frick, one of the main architects of Nazi legislation, was tried at the Nuremberg trial for his involvement in creating racial and anti-Semitic laws, including the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. A key figure in implementing Nazi ideology into the German legal system, he was sentenced to death by hanging and executed in 1946. In this image, Heinrich Joeckel walks toward the gallows, bearing the weight of his own atrocities. On October 6, 1946, in Czechoslovakia, he was condemned by the People's Court for commanding brutal tortures and ordering mass executions at the small fortress in Terezin, where he played a central role in the repression and horrors inflicted on prisoners. During the Nuremberg war crimes trials, Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, was tried and convicted for war crimes in 1947. Responsible for inhumane medical experiments, he faced justice in one of the most emblematic post-World War II trials. Subsequently, Brandt was executed, becoming a symbol of accountability for the horrors of the Nazi regime. After the war crimes trials in Nuremberg in 1946, Christ Eisbusch stands at the gallows, condemned to death for overseeing the massacre of entire villages as part of Nazi retaliation efforts. In the image, he faces his fate with an unexpected smile, captured by the cameras. During the Nuremberg trials in 1946, Emil Hoffmann faced the gallows for ordering the massacre of entire villages in retaliation for resistance to Hitler's regime. Before the execution, he made his final statement, carrying the weight of his actions. "My loyalty to the Führer does not justify what I did." Victor Brack, a central figure in the Nazi euthanasia and forced sterilization programs, was sentenced to death by hanging during the Nuremberg trial in August 1947. Accused of crimes against humanity, he was held responsible for overseeing brutal medical experiments on prisoners at concentration camps. The image shows Waldemar Hoven, SS chief doctor at Buchenwald, testifying in his defense at the doctor's trial in Nuremberg. Hoven was accused of injecting phenol directly into the hearts of prisoners, among other cruel experiments. Condemned for war crimes and crimes against humanity, he was sentenced to death by the jury. The image captures the execution of Henry Wirtz, commander of the Andersonville prison, on November 10, 1865, in Washington, D.C. Condemned for war crimes, Wirtz was held accountable for the inhumane conditions and high mortality rate among prisoners under his custody during the American Civil War. Hans Frank, a member of the Nazi Party since 1927, was Minister of Justice and, in 1939, was appointed governor of occupied Poland. During his rule, millions of Jews were subjected to forced labor and extermination camps were established. At the Nuremberg trial, he initially denied involvement, but later admitted guilt and condemned Hitler. For his crimes against humanity, he was sentenced to death and hanged in 1946. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who oversaw the Gestapo and the Einsatzgruppen, was responsible for exterminating Jews and communists. Testimonies and documentary evidence at the Nuremberg trial showed his direct connection to extermination camps, such as Mauthausen. During the Nuremberg trial, he was sentenced to death by hanging for his participation in crimes against humanity. After the war, those responsible for the experiments were spared from trial in exchange for scientific data acquired from the tests. The United States, interested in the results for their own biological weapons program, allowed the war criminals to escape without punishment or trial. In this image, Mihaly Weigel, an opponent of the Austro-Hungarian regime, faces his final moments in the courtyard of a prison in Hungary in 1907. Condemned for challenging the imperial order, he was executed as an opponent of the regime. The image, secretly captured through a window, reveals the tense and silent atmosphere, highlighting resistance during a period of intense political and social repression in the region of Austria. Also in the same courtyard years later, Laszlo Ferenczy, former minister of the pro-Nazi Selassie government, was sentenced to death for deporting thousands of Jews to extermination camps and actively collaborating with the Nazi regime. On May 31, 1946, he heard his final verdict in the People's Court. From another angle, Laszlo Ferenczy is seen kissing a crucifix, surrounded by religious authorities and onlookers in his final moments before execution. This powerful record captures the last moment of a convicted Nazi collaborator in Hungary. Walter Funk, former president of the Reichsbank, faced charges at the Nuremberg trial for storing gold and jewelry taken from Jewish victims and for his economic collaboration with the Nazi extermination system. Although there was no proof of direct involvement in crimes against humanity, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. After the war crimes trials in 1946, Karl Grunwald waits at the gallows, condemned for ordering the execution of civilians in retaliation for resistance attacks. The image, capturing his final moments, symbolized justice confronting those responsible for the atrocities that defined the horrors of World War II. In this image, Nazi guards, including Irma Gries, known as the hyena of Auschwitz, are depicted. As a supervisor at the Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen concentration camps, Gries was responsible for torturing, abusing, and murdering prisoners, including women and children. After the war, she was captured, tried for her war crimes at the Bergen-Belsen trial, and sentenced to death by hanging on December 13, 1945, at the age of 22. In the photo from the day of the trial, Herta Ehlert, Irma Gries, and Josephine Brandel are shown, all judged at the Belsen Tribunal for war crimes. Ehlert, a supervisor at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, was sentenced to 15 years in prison for abuses against prisoners. Gries, the hyena of Auschwitz, was sentenced to death for tortures and murders, being hanged in 1945, and Brandel, a guard at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, was sentenced to prison for her involvement in the cruelties of the Nazi regime. Unit 731, led by Shiro Ishii, conducted brutal experiments during World War II on prisoners, including Chinese and Russians. They were subjected to vivisection, infection with diseases such as cholera and anthrax, and tests with biological weapons. Thousands died due to the extreme conditions and tortures inflicted. In this image, Ethel Rosenberg appears alongside her husband, Julius Rosenberg. The couple was accused of conspiring to spy for the Soviet Union during the Cold War, passing nuclear secrets to the Russians. Despite contested evidence and public division over the case, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's Minister of Foreign Affairs, played a central role in World War II. Appointed in 1938, he supported the deportation of Jews to extermination camps in the East and was directly involved in the extermination policy. At the Nuremberg trial, he admitted his involvement in genocide and was sentenced to death by hanging. Hermann Göring, Hitler's right-hand man, was the architect of the Aryanization and the laws that devastated the lives of Jews in Germany, brutally excluding them from the economy. At the Nuremberg trial, he faced his destiny with the heavy sentence of death, carrying the guilt of his atrocities and the weight of the regime he helped build. Every word and action of his echoed the horrors that marked history. Iwane Matsui, general of the Imperial Japanese Army, commanded the troops that captured Nanjing in 1937, orchestrating the brutal massacre. Under his leadership, thousands of civilians and prisoners were killed in unimaginable atrocities. At the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Matsui was sentenced to death by hanging in 1948 for his war crimes. Known as the Angel of Death of Auschwitz, Josef Mengele conducted inhumane medical experiments on prisoners, seeking answers for the perverse Nazi ideologies. After the war, he was captured but fled to South America, where he lived in hiding until his death. His trial never occurred, but his figure became synonymous with the atrocities that marked the Holocaust. Friedrich Paulus, Field Marshal of the Wehrmacht, led the Sixth Army in the disastrous Battle of Stalingrad, where he surrendered in 1943, a crucial point in the war. Captured by the Soviets, Paulus was pardoned for his collaboration with the Allies and cooperated with them, testifying at Nuremberg against Nazi leaders. After the war, he lived in East Germany until his death in 1957, living under the shadow of his surrender and redemption. Alfred Rosenberg, racial ideologist of Nazism and one of the first members of the Nazi Party, was a key figure in anti-Semitic propaganda and the ideological justification for the Holocaust. As minister of the occupied Eastern Territories, he planned the subjugation of Russia and actively supported mass extermination. Condemned for crimes against humanity at the Nuremberg trial, he was executed by hanging in 1946. In this image, Hideki Tojo, Prime Minister of Japan for most of World War II, is in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo, being tried for war crimes. Tojo was accused of planning and conducting wars of aggression, including the attack on Pearl Harbor, and of allowing atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war. Sentenced to death by hanging, he was executed in 1948. In this photo, Kenji Doihara, a Japanese general, is remembered for his leadership in atrocities committed during the occupation of Manchuria. Responsible for forcing millions into slave labor and conducting grotesque human experiments, he was tried in the International Military Tribunal. Sentenced to death for his crimes against humanity, he was executed in 1948, paying for the horrors he caused to the innocent. Fritz Sauckel, responsible for labor mobilization in the Nazi regime, coordinated the forced deportation of about 5 million workers, mostly from Eastern Europe. These individuals were subjected to brutal conditions of slave labor, essential for the German war economy. Judged at the Nuremberg trial for crimes against humanity, Sauckel was sentenced to death and executed by hanging in 1946. In this image, Karl Wolff, an SS officer directly involved in the deportation of 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto, one of the many cruel crimes of the Nazi regime. Sentenced in 1964 to 15 years in prison, he served only part of the sentence due to his cooperation with the Allies, including negotiations for Germany's surrender in 1945. His early release in 1971 sparked strong criticism, exposing flaws in post-war justice. In this image, Hans Albin Rauter, SS commander in the Netherlands, hears his death sentence after a month of trial in The Hague. Responsible for the deportation of 110,000 Dutch Jews and brutal repression of resistance, he tried to claim ignorance of the deaths, but was contradicted by evidence presented by the jury, leading to his eventual conviction. Akira Muto, general of the Imperial Japanese Army, was responsible for atrocities in northern China, including forced labor, executions of prisoners, and massacres of civilians. He was involved in the Nanjing Massacre of 1937, where hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war were killed. Tried at the International Military Tribunal, he was executed in 1948 for his crimes. Alfred Jodl, head of the Wehrmacht Operations Section, played a central role in the destruction of Czechoslovakia and the invasion of the Soviet Union, actions he justified as preventive measures of war. At the Nuremberg trial, he defended himself by claiming he was merely following superior orders, but was sentenced to death by hanging, stating in his final moments that the judgment was up to history and the Almighty. Erich Raeder, commander of the German Navy, was accused of war-related crimes. Evidence against him included his participation in a general plan and conspiracy in indiscriminate attacks on merchant ships, violating international law. Raeder was sentenced to life imprisonment and, due to health problems, was released in 1955, dying in 1960. Julius Streicher was the editor-in-chief of the newspaper Der Stürmer, famous for its anti-Semitic propaganda. He spread immense hatred against Jews, being described as the most rabid anti-Semite in Germany. Baldur von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth, consolidated youth groups under Nazi ideology, keeping them separate from the Wehrmacht. His anti-Semitism, influenced by Henry Ford, marked his actions, including active support for the deportation of Jews to extermination camps. Accused of planning an aggressive war, the evidence against him was weak, but his role in the persecution of Jews ensured his conviction. At the Nuremberg trial, documents proved that Baldur knew and approved the deportation of Jews from Vienna to extermination camps and the murders committed by the Einsatzgruppen mobile vans in Poland. For his direct involvement in these crimes, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Schirach served his sentence at Spandau prison, being released only in 1974. Erich von Manstein, a field marshal of the Wehrmacht, was responsible for decisive campaigns such as the invasion of France and operations against the Soviet Union. Accused of war crimes, including forced deportations and slave labor, he was tried by a British tribunal in 1949 and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Despite the gravity of his crimes, he was released in 1953 due to health reasons, which sparked great controversy at the time. Under pressure from Hitler, Artur Seyss-Inquart, who appears next to Hitler in this photo, was appointed Austria's interior minister, and after Schuschnigg's resignation, became chancellor. He quickly summoned German troops seeking to annex Austria to the Reich. In 1939, he was appointed vice-governor of Poland, where he contributed to the Lublin Plan, deporting Jews from the Reich to areas of Eastern Europe, intensifying Nazi persecution policies. At the Nuremberg trial, Seyss-Inquart was charged with 4 accusations: war crimes, crimes against peace, against humanity, and conspiracy. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging, with the sentence executed in 1946. In this photo, Konstantin von Neurath, Hitler's former foreign minister, is condemned for his involvement in the recolonization of Czechoslovakia following the Lebensraum ideology, which advocated for Germany's territorial expansion eastward, justifying the occupation and extermination of undesirable peoples. Sentenced to 15 years in prison, he was released in 1954 for health reasons and died in 1956. Gustav Krukenberg, an officer of the 33rd SS Charlemagne Division, led the troops in the desperate defense of Berlin against the Soviet advance in 1945. After the German surrender, he was captured, tried, and sentenced to death for war crimes due to the atrocities committed under his command, including massacres and persecutions of civilians and prisoners during the war. Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA, played a crucial role in Hitler's rise to power, commanding the stormtroopers who used violence to intimidate opponents. However, his ambitions to turn the SA into a military force rivaling the Wehrmacht put him in conflict with Hitler. During the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, he was arrested and executed by Hitler's order, consolidating the Führer's absolute power within the Nazi Party. Otto Skorzeny, an SS officer, became famous for his daring operations during World War II, such as the rescue of Benito Mussolini in 1943, and infiltrations behind enemy lines during the Ardennes offensive. Nicknamed the most dangerous man in Europe, he was captured after the war but acquitted in 1947 due to lack of evidence. Heitaro Kimura, general of the Imperial Japanese Army, is seen in this image during his trial. Kimura played his role overseeing forced labor in the construction of the Death Railway, which caused the deaths of thousands of prisoners of war and civilians. Tried for war crimes, he was sentenced to death by hanging and executed in 1948. Seishiro Itagaki, general of the Imperial Japanese Army and Minister of War, was one of the main perpetrators of Japan's military expansion and planning for aggression during World War II. He was tried by the International Military Tribunal, sentenced to death for his war crimes, and executed in 1948, paying for the horrors he helped unleash. Koki Hirota, former Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan, was responsible for Japan's military expansion and the formation of the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. He was also involved in the Nanjing Massacre, where thousands of civilians were brutally murdered. Tried by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, he was sentenced to death and hanged in 1948 for his crimes against humanity. Ernst von Weizsäcker, a diplomat and member of the Nazi Party, held the position of Secretary of State between 1938 and 1943, where he played a crucial role in the diplomacy that facilitated the deportation of Jews from occupied France to extermination camps. Even though he was a reluctant conservative, his complicity in the horrors of the regime was undeniable. Tried at the Nuremberg Tribunal, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison, but was released in 1950. Kurt Daluege, head of the Order Police and SS leader in occupied Czechoslovakia, was crucial in the unrelenting repression of the Nazi regime. Responsible for deportations and mass executions after the war, he was captured, tried in Prague for crimes against humanity, and sentenced to death by hanging in 1946, paying for his role in the atrocities committed. In this image, Werner Best, an SS officer and Nazi jurist, is pictured after his capture in Copenhagen in 1945. As Reich Commissioner in occupied Denmark, he implemented brutal policies against the resistance and was responsible for the deportation of Jews. Tried after the war, he was sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. In this image, Otto Ohlendorf is seen during his trial at the Nuremberg trials. Commander of the Einsatzgruppen, he confessed to executing about 90,000 people, mainly Jews, in occupied eastern territories. His direct participation in mass massacres led him to be sentenced to death by hanging for crimes against humanity. A different case. Hans Oster, general of the Wehrmacht and member of the Abwehr, used his position within the German army to sabotage the Nazi regime. He provided information to the resistance, helped Jews escape, and participated in conspiracies against Hitler, including the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt. Discovered and imprisoned in 1943, he was sentenced to death for treason and hanged on April 9, 1945, at the Flossenburg concentration camp just days before the regime's collapse. In this photo, Hermann Göring, one of the leading figures of the Nazi regime, founder of the Gestapo, and commander of the Luftwaffe, was a key figure in consolidating Hitler's power. At the Nuremberg trial, he was sentenced to death for war crimes and crimes against humanity due to his role in the final solution, the Nazi plan that led to the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews through deportations to extermination camps, gas chambers, and forced labor. Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS and head of the Gestapo, was a central figure in executing Nazi terror policies. Under his command, concentration and extermination camps such as Auschwitz were established, and slave labor was widely used. Captured in 1945, Himmler was to be tried for crimes against humanity, but his capture and elimination occurred before the Nuremberg trials began. Founder of the Belgian fascist Rexist movement, Leon Degrelle joined the Nazis during World War II, fighting fiercely alongside Hitler's troops. After the regime's defeat, he fled to Spain, where he was sentenced to death but had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment. Franz von Papen, appointed Reich Chancellor by Hindenburg, became ambassador in Vienna after Hitler's rise to power. Charged at the Nuremberg trial for supporting the expansion of Nazi power, there was insufficient evidence to incriminate him. His acquittal caused outrage, revealing significant flaws in the pursuit of justice against those responsible for the Nazi regime. At the Nuremberg trial, Julius Streicher was convicted of incitement to genocide and crimes against humanity. Although he did not directly participate in the war, his influence was key in fueling hatred, and on October 1, 1946, he was sentenced to death by hanging. Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief of staff, was directly responsible for brutal policies such as the Night and Fog, 1941, which aimed to arrest and eliminate opponents without any prior trial. Under this policy, prisoners, mostly from the resistance, were secretly captured and summarily executed. Keitel, loyal to the commander-in-chief, was sentenced to death for his complicity in war crimes during the Nuremberg trial. Hjalmar Schacht, former Nazi economy minister, faced charges of contributing to Hitler's rise and supporting German rearmament. Although his anti-Semitism was part of his beliefs, no direct involvement in war crimes or significant military planning was proven. With insufficient evidence, he was acquitted at the Nuremberg trial, closing one of the most controversial cases of the trials. In this photo, Albert Speer is seen next to Hitler, with whom he maintained close collaboration. As the Reich's architect and from 1942 Minister of Armament, Speer played a crucial role in Nazi military logistics. Responsible for large public works, he also oversaw arms production, optimizing the supply of war-essential resources. At the Nuremberg trial, Speer admitted knowing about the Nazi program and denied direct responsibility for the most severe crimes. However, his role in the war machine and logistical support was undeniable during the trial. Expressing regret, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison and was later released in 1966, passing away in 1981. In this capture from the doctor's trial in Nuremberg, Hertha Oberheiser, a doctor at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, listens to her sentence for conducting cruel experiments, such as inserting pieces of glass and wood into the wounds of prisoners to simulate war injuries. Responsible for inhumane acts during the regime, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Rudolf Hess was one of the first to oversee euthanasia and genocide programs in Nazi Germany, playing a crucial role in the early stages of the Holocaust. Although considered by Churchill as a minor war criminal, he was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Nuremberg trial and served over 40 years in prison. This photo captured Rudolf Hess during his time in detention at Spandau, where he served his life sentence. He remained isolated in the facility until his death in 1987 at the age of 93, becoming the last prisoner of Spandau. Hans Fritzsche, radio announcer and collaborator of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, played a significant role in spreading Nazi propaganda. Although he broadcasted crucial messages for the regime, it was not proven that he was responsible for creating these messages. At the Nuremberg trial, Fritzsche was acquitted, partly due to the absence of concrete evidence against him and his defense claiming his adherence to anti-Semitism was passive and conformist. In this image, Rudolf Brandt, an SS officer, was held responsible for repression operations, mass murders, and the implementation of extermination policies. Brandt was accused of coordinating brutal medical experiments on prisoners and the deportation of Jews to extermination camps. Sentenced to death by hanging, he was held accountable as an accomplice in the crimes of the Nazi regime. This image shows Edith Cavell, a British nurse who, during World War I, risked her life to help Allied soldiers escape from German occupation in Belgium. Captured by the Germans, she was tried and sentenced for treason. Executed by firing squad on October 12, 1915. Her death caused international outrage, making her an icon of courage and sacrifice during the conflict. In the image, we see Maria Mandel, a senior guard at Auschwitz and Majdanek, known for her extreme cruelty, including torturing prisoners. After the war, she was captured and tried at the Belsen trial, where she was convicted for her war crimes. However, Mandel died of natural causes in 1976 while awaiting a new trial, never fully facing justice for her atrocities. Martin Bormann, Hitler's right-hand man after Rudolf Hess's departure, played a central role in the final days of the Nazi regime, remaining in the bunker until April 30, 1945. Known for his brutality, he was sentenced to death by hanging at the Nuremberg trial, held responsible for the deportation of Jews to extermination camps and the exploitation of forced labor on a large scale during the regime. After Hitler's rejection of the Treaty of Versailles in 1935, Karl Donitz led the German Navy's submarine unit, becoming a vice admiral in 1940. At the Nuremberg trial, he was accused of war crimes for sinking British merchant ships, defending himself by pointing out similar practices by the Allies. Sentenced to 10 years, he served his sentence in Spandau, Berlin. In the photo is General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, an officer in the Wehrmacht during World War II, whose war crimes are marked in history. He ordered the brutal execution of 15 American soldiers who had surrendered in 1944. Violating the Geneva Conventions and committing war crimes. Condemned for his atrocities, he was executed, paying with his life for the horror he caused.